Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gasola, and welcome to the Unauthorized Disclosure Podcast. I'm one of the show's co-hosts, and I'm pleased to be joined by a returning guest, Ben Norton, who is an editor with the Geopolitical Economy Report, and he's here joining me to discuss the election result in Argentina, among other issues. So, welcome, Ben.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And if people don't know, I'm just going to put this on screen. This is your website. This is Geopolitical Economy Report. There's lots of fantastic and important articles. You also can find your channel on YouTube as well to get breakdowns. Like you can see the one there that we might come back to about U.S. support for Israel, where you interviewed economist Michael Hudson. But of course, you also did a very well constructed breakdown of the outcome in Argentina and how this figure ended up winning, Javier Milei. I think I might say his name wrong. I sort of think of I'm getting it confused with the My Lai massacre in Vietnam because it has the same ring. Of course, I think there might be people, particularly on the left, who feel like they could be massacred now that Javier Milei is
It's a
the
very
president.
appropriate historical echo, if you will.
So, one of the things I was drawn to, so just to start our conversations, there's so many places you can begin, but there's also some aspects of his candidacy that have, for what it's worth, entered, we'll call it the liberal mainstream. There was a not so bad segment that Last Week Tonight put together on Javier Milei's candidacy, focusing more on what we'll call the absurd aspects of his campaign, which I know you talked about in your video. But we'll get into the more serious elements of what he presents as a figure. Not like those bizarre things don't matter. I think they certainly will have an impact on how he governs and the extent to which he may rule like a military dictator. But if we go back to this, I pulled that's Javier Milei, in case you are unfamiliar for anybody viewing the show. But I pulled this just because you had a good breakdown of his extreme libertarian fascist platform of militarizing institutions during his presidential transition, of building for-profit public-private prisons, making it easier to imprison people, mandating forced labor for prisoners, reducing the age of being considered a minor, and creating a nationwide surveillance network of cameras with facial recognition technology. I want to say that I didn't feel like I was stunned. It seemed almost inevitable because the I'm not going to be able to remember the candidate's name off the top of my head, but it seemed to be almost inevitable, or something that would be hard to avoid, because the candidate that Javier was up against had this affiliation with the finance ministry, and economics is the problem in Argentina. And so the establishment, or the ruling class, almost had no answer for this figure, this extreme fascist figure, which is something that I think everyone has to contend with. But of course, I know you also recognize that there's a judicial coup element to this. We talked about this on the show. I don't think it was with you, but probably with Zoe Alexandra when she was on, and Christina Kirchner had been banned from being able to run, which robbed the left, or even the liberal center, whatever, of any person that they could go to as possibly an alternative to Javier. So anyways, I throw it to you.
Yeah, you did a great overview. Very briefly, I just want to mention some details about Milei, and then I'll explain why I think he won and some of the other details, like, for instance, the fact that there was no left candidate in the election. It was really an election between the center right, the conservative right, and the far right. And in Argentina, there are 2 rounds normally to the presidential election. If a candidate doesn't get over 50% or 10% more than the next candidate in the first round, it goes to a runoff. And in the first round, there was the economic minister, Sergio Massa, who's really a kind of center-right neoliberal. And then there was a conservative right-winger, Patricia Bullrich, and she's from the right-wing party of former President Mauricio Macri, which is the kind of traditional, oligarchic conservative right wing. And then you had this far right, supposed libertarian Javier Milei, who's a libertarian in the sense that Pinochet wasn't a libertarian, right? So who is this guy Milei? Well, he's a self-declared ANCAP, an anarcho-capitalist. And you've probably seen these weirdos on the internet. I mean, until recently, they were just a joke. And a lot of people in Argentina considered him to be this crazy far-right gadfly. He became well known because he was just brought out in the media as a far-right voice, and he would do all these debates. And then he became more and more mainstream, and he had some support from some wealthy oligarchs in Argentina. And it's because of his proposals. So he ran on the campaign pledging that he's going to abolish the central bank and get rid of Argentina's monetary sovereignty and adopt the US dollar as the currency of the country. It's a crazy idea in many ways. I can talk about that later. And many countries in the world right now are de-dollarizing because of the weaponization of the dollar by the US government. And he's trying to dollarize, which, as the well-known mainstream development economist Ha Jun Chang said, he's a South Korean development economist who taught at Cambridge. He said that if Milei did this, then Argentina might as well apply to be a US colony because its macroeconomic policy would be dictated by Washington. And that's exactly right. Now, furthermore, in addition to that crazy idea, Milei claimed that he wants to abolish basically every single government ministry. And there's a viral video that was viral. It was a very famous clip in which he said that he wants to get rid of the health ministry, education, transport, the ministry for women's affairs, for workers, the labor ministry, the public works ministry. He wants to get rid of Social Security. I mean, he wants to implement the most extreme far-right libertarian program you can imagine, which includes privatization of all these institutions, but it also includes militarization of the country. And as you cited at the beginning, in the program that he released, the platform that he released for his party, which is called Liberty Advances or Freedom Advances, ironically, in that platform, he called for banning abortion. So a libertarian who wants the state to control women's bodies, and as to deal with unwanted children because of abortion being illegal, he also proposed the idea of making a so-called free market of adoptions, which means buying and selling children. And he got this idea from the far-right libertarian ANCAP, Murray Rothbard, who started out as a libertarian, and by the end of his life, he became a paleo-conservative and was allying with the KKK, and he supported David Duke when he ran for office, and he called for this so-called right-wing populist alliance between libertarians and the far right, fascists, white supremacists. So Milei is very much coming out of this kind of, alt-right, supposedly an ANCAP, but really it's kind of neo-reactionary background, combining so-called libertarian ideas. So getting rid of the state when the state's good, like helping people and helping poor people, giving Social Security and education, healthcare, all the good things the state does, he wants to get rid of. And he wants to keep all the bad things that the state does, like prisons. He wants to make more prisons, and he wants to make them privatized and for profit. He said he wants more police. He wants to give police more weapons, and he wants to militarize the country. In his platform, he called for militarization of the country during the transition, is the term he uses. And when does the transition end? Well, whenever he wants. So it's militarization of the country. So, I mean, I kind of jokingly, but not so jokingly in Twitter said it's like libertarian fascism. I mean, again, it's all of the worst things that libertarians want and none of the good things that libertarians want. So all of the progressive elements of the state are gone, and all of the repressive elements of the state are accentuated. Now, in terms of his foreign policy, Milei also has said that his foreign policy will be allied with the US and Israel. And he's repeated that many times. And he has pledged that he will break relations with both China and Brazil because he says they're both run by communists. He claims that the Workers' Party and Brazil's leftist president, Lula da Silva, is a communist, despite the fact that he's a progressive social democrat and a nationalist, but he's not a communist. Anyway, so Milei said that he wants to break off relations with the two largest trading partners of Argentina, which are responsible for 35% of trade of the country. And furthermore, he has strongly supported Israel. And I know you wanted to later talk about this massacre that Israel is carrying out in Gaza. Well, recently, before the second round of the election on the 19th of November, Milei had a rally in which he was waving a big Israeli flag. So again, I mean, he's really like a Trumpist figure or a Bolsonaro figure in Brazil, representing the kind of far right that's on the rise around much of the world, these fascistic forces. But he uses much more of an explicitly libertarian rhetoric. And the reason he won is because, again, there was actually no left candidate, because the most popular politician in the country, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, who was previously president, she was banned from running because of what was essentially a judicial coup. Because in Argentina, the judicial system is notoriously, cartoonishly corrupt. And there have been a series of scandals in which some of the right-wing oligarchs in the country were caught wining and dining judges and sending them out on their private jets to their mansions to go on luxurious vacations and go golfing. So some of these judges who were conspiring with the right wing, they had hundreds of bogus cases. I'm not exaggerating, literally hundreds of bogus cases against Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. And after years and years of these frivolous cases, they finally got her on this ridiculous, politically motivated, fraudulent charge, and she was banned from running for office ever again. And furthermore, this was right after a failed assassination attempt against her by a far-right extremist who had expressed support for Milei, by the way. So the radical right in Argentina, and there's a very long history of the extreme right, and of course being supported by the US, especially during the first Cold War and so-called Operation Condor, or Plan Condor as it's called in Spanish, when there was a right-wing military dictatorship which was known for killing and torturing and disappearing tens of thousands of leftists. I have friends in Argentina who have family members and they never knew what happened to them, like aunts, uncles, grandparents, and still today they're looking for them because they were disappeared by the military dictatorship. Milei, by the way, has consistently whitewashed the dictatorship, and his running mate also has refused adamantly to publicly criticize the dictatorship. And anyway, the point is that these radical right forces in Argentina, they've always maintained influence, especially in the judiciary and in the police and the military. And they were always a thorn in the side of the Kirchners, the leftists, when they were in power in the 2000s. And basically, we saw this come to fruition, where there was no left alternative, and the current ruling party, which is a very broad coalition, including some left-wing forces, but also some centrist and even center-right forces of the Peronists, Peronism is very complicated. If you want, I can talk about it, but essentially it has its origins in the nationalist leader Juan Domingo Perón, who embarked upon an ambitious program of national industrialization. And basically, there are left-wing Peronists, but there are also conservative Peronists, and it's very complicated. Anyway, the point is they have this broad coalition, and the candidate they ended up running, because he had the most name recognition, was the economic minister. But that also ended up being a horrible decision, because he was the economic minister at a time when Argentina is trapped in all this unpayable, odious debt owed to the International Monetary Fund and owed to vulture funds and asset managers like BlackRock on Wall Street. So there's been an economic crisis with inflation of over 100%. And they made the insane decision of choosing their economic minister, who was associated with those policies, and again, who's basically a neoliberal. They chose him as the candidate to run against the far right. And just as we saw in the US election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, when you have the choice between a center-right neoliberal or a far-right so-called populist, well, unfortunately, it looks like the far-right so-called populist often ends up winning.
Yeah, and I also wonder if Joe Biden, being 81 years old and choosing to run for re-election, doesn't present that same dynamic. And with even a worse scenario where you have, you know, 4, 5 different criminal cases brought against a president, you have all the makings of someone that, despite my reticence when it comes to embracing a lot of the things that are said by the MSNBC viewership, they might have some validity when they're speaking about the fascistic attitude and ideas and program that a Trump second term, or a Trump term after Biden would look like, with all the
Yeah, I
people he would
agree.
empower, like Stephen Miller, for one, who would just probably shut down the border and start deporting millions of people in the US en masse if he could have his dream. So I think about this dynamic, and as I listen to you, Brazil comes up because of what you're saying, where trade would be cut off with Brazil potentially, and probably because of the fact that Lula is in charge. And so I'm wondering if you want to take just a moment to say, um, like, how similar is what we're seeing to the rise of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil earlier? And then obviously Brazil was able to find its way back to re-electing Lula. So it seems like what Brazilians did in response to Bolsonaro is probably going to be instructive for the left in Argentina.
Absolutely. There are a lot of parallels. And of course, Argentina and Brazil are neighbors. They have a lot in common historically, culturally, economically. Although Brazil is much more industrialized, and Lula and the Workers' Party have been trying to reindustrialize Brazil. In fact, when in his first term in the early 2000s, 20 years ago, under Lula, because this is Lula's third term, he had two terms, and then there was Dilma Rousseff from the Workers' Party. And then in 2016, there was a US backed kind of political coup against Dilma Rousseff. She was impeached on bogus charges based on this ridiculous formality that Bolsonaro did regularly. And then there was this neoliberal leader that came in, Michel Temer. And then in 2018, Lula was running for president again against Bolsonaro, but he was imprisoned on fake charges by this US backed, US trained judge, Sergio Moro, who famously was collaborating with the US Justice Department. Extremely corrupt scandal. I mean, a judicial coup. A textbook example of lawfare, legal warfare, right? Which is also what happened against Kirchner in Argentina. Well, now, so Lula was in prison on fake charges, and that's the reason that Bolsonaro won the election. So there are so many parallels here. The only reason that the far right could come to power is because there was no left alternative allowed in the election in Brazil in 2018 and in Argentina this November. And of course, under Bolsonaro, Brazil was a complete disaster. We saw the implementation of extreme neoliberal economic policies, and the super economic minister under Bolsonaro was an avowed Pinochet follower. And he himself actually he had taught economics, right-wing economics in Chile under the Pinochet dictatorship, and he became the economic minister under Bolsonaro. His name was Paulo Guedes. And similarly, we see Milei promising a different program. However, the conditions in both countries are very different. So, Milei, I mentioned that he said repeatedly, he claimed that he will cut relations both politically and commercially with Brazil, Argentina's largest trading partner, and China, its second largest. Now, this is preposterous. This is not going to happen in a million years. I really do not think it will happen. It would be complete suicide. First of all, one of the significant differences is that in Brazil, I was mentioning that Lula is trying to reindustrialize. In his first term, what the top exports of Brazil were plane engines, jet engines. So Brazil does have a history, like Argentina, but more so in Brazil, of having an industrial sector and not simply being basically a resource extraction hub for raw materials and agricultural products. In Latin America, there's this kind of neo-colonial reality where many countries economically, their model is basically based on the export of raw materials and agricultural products. And many of these countries were more industrialized in terms of that is that manufacturing made up more of a percentage of their economy in the 50s and 60s and 70s than today. So, in the kind of Keynesian era of developmental nationalism in countries like Brazil and Argentina, there was a much more diverse economy. Now, today in Argentina, the vast majority of exports consist of agricultural products, mostly soy products, corn, wheat, beef. Argentina is a big beef producer, and it's hard to replace markets for selling those products. I mean, China is the world's largest consumer of soy. Obviously, it's 1.4 billion people. It's an important part of the Chinese diet. You can't just Milei, even if he wanted, he couldn't just find a country to import these huge amounts of soy. So, I mean, he has no idea what he's talking about. People say what's funny is he presented himself as an economist, and people in the media sometimes refer to Milei as an economist. He's not an economist. He is a far-right libertarian ideologue. He has no macroeconomic experience of actually being involved in running an economy. He's simply, I mean, he's a textbook libertarian, and it's going to be a complete disaster. He has no idea what he's doing. Now, furthermore, you were talking about the parallels with Bolsonaro, and it's important to mention that the far right forces in Latin America were physically present in Argentina campaigning for Milei. So what we're seeing is this kind of far right fascist international, right? So during both the first round and the second round of the Argentine election, Jair Bolsonaro's son, Eduardo Bolsonaro, was in Argentina trying to campaign for Milei. Also, the Pinochet admiring presidential candidate from Chile, Jose Antonio Cast, who lost the last election narrowly, he was also in Argentina campaigning for Milei. And Jose Antonio Cast is a multimillionaire oligarch in Chile, and he comes from a family of Nazi collaborators. And he himself, when he was young, was an avowed card-carrying member of the supporter of the Pinochet regime. And there's a famous video of him under Pinochet when he was a student, and he's talking about how much he loves Pinochet. So, like, I mean, when I say these people are fascists, I'm not just throwing that word around as an insult. Like, they quite literally are admiring the fascist dictatorships that govern Latin America under Operation Condor in the 60s and 70s. So it is important to talk about Bolsonaro and Trump, but in the case of Argentina and in the case of Brazil and Chile, Trump is a more new phenomenon. We need to keep in mind in Latin America, there were these fascist dictatorships that governed, and there are people, older people in these countries who remember those years. And obviously, they're not the ones voting for these people. It's actually the young people who have no recollection of the far right dictatorships who are largely voting for these forces. But of course, these far right forces in Latin America also have the support of the oligarchy. And in the case of Brazil, there's a very strong oligarchy. But in the case of Argentina, it's almost ridiculous. I mean, it's like a joke that the landed oligarch elite in Argentina. I mean, you can like draw a straight line to the Spanish colonialists and the landed oligarchy today, who have always supported the most reactionary right-wing forces and always tried to prevent industrialization and diversification of the economy. And the entire Argentine economy is reliant on agricultural exports that are controlled by these big ag corporations owned by these oligarchs who just inherited land generation after generation and have dominated politics for 100 years.
Yeah, that's a very good explanation. And this resurgence or the surgence of these fascistic leaders, we're seeing it right now. I don't want to pronounce victory yet, but it's not lost on me that as I have this conversation for you, they've said that Geert Wilders is very close to having the prime minister position in the Netherlands. And that is just wild to me because I remembered the name, and you know why? I don't know what your association is, but he's etched in my mind because he was part of the circus that came to New York City to stop the construction of this mosque back in 2010 and had people like, I'm sure there's many who have purged this name from their memory, but like Pamela Geller, who was involved in these like very Islamophobic organizations and campaigning. They send those like DVDs straight to you in like mailings that you used to be able to like, pop in your player at home and then get the fear. It was like the fear was delivered directly to you by mail, but now people can just get it on Twitter or Facebook or however they want to. But for a while, people were making these DVDs and just sending them to people to make them scared of Muslims. So, like what we're seeing happen, there is this element too that I wanted to get to of US support for what is unfolding in Argentina, but particularly the right wing media machine or the right wing conservative industry of think tanks and publishing. I have this clip that I'm going to play, but I picked this clip. So there's actually two clips that I want to show you and get your response. But I'm starting with this clip, and admittedly, it's the more boring one. But there's also something about it that I believe encapsulates exactly why there are people who, even if they think Javier Milei is completely out there, I mean, talking to his dead dog Conan out there, even though he is that insane, and if he was a lefty, there was no way that any of these people would let him off the hook for being that insane. They recognize the opportunity that Javier presents for them, and they're just so excited to jump all over it. So I'm gonna play this clip, and it's Steve Forbes, and he was doing this for his magazine, Forbes magazine, and Forbes presents itself as like a foremost kind of like capitalist investor magazine. Of course, it covers other world issues outside of just global markets or just market economies, but this is just a good distillation, I believe, of what the ruling class is looking to get out of Javier's presidency.
Is on the way. Argentinian voters just elected a new president, Javier Milei. He won in a landslide, getting the highest percentage of the popular vote since the country returned to democracy in 1983. His victory on a free market platform is noteworthy because its implications go well beyond his country's borders. Free markets enable people to better their lives by channeling their energies in productive pursuits. Creativity and investment flourish. His success would provide a powerful antidote to the socialist wave washing across Latin America and much of the world. The platform of this self-described anarcho-capitalism is an eye-opener. His big campaign proposal replaced the near-worthless peso with the U.S. dollar. He also advocates slashing taxes, bulldozing bloated bureaucracies, obliterating mountains of regulations, taking a chainsaw to government spending, and sending the central bank to a museum. He believes in free trade. He wants Argentinians to pursue more commerce with capitalist countries like the U.S., rather than with China. He holds other conventional views, most notably that climate change is not man-made. He says he may well convert to Judaism, this in a nation that had been notorious for harboring Nazi war criminals. Milei will face powerful forces dedicated to thwarting his plans. The Catholic Church in Argentina opposed his candidacy openly. Needless to say, so did the entire political establishment, including the country's powerful unions and businesses dependent on the government. But Milei now has a powerful popular mandate. Key to Milei's success is indeed dollarizing the economy. While the U.S. greenback is hardly a beacon of sound money these days, it is infinitely preferable to the peso. The dollar would enable people to pursue everyday routines instead of scrambling to find their next meal. Businesses could focus on productive activities, such as starting new enterprises, expanding existing ones, and boosting productivity. Venture capital would blossom. Economists carp that Argentina doesn't have enough dollars to make the conversion. They just don't know what they're talking about. True, the government is busted, but the actual value of the current peso money supply is around $50 billion. Argentinians hold some 265 billion US dollars either overseas or under mattresses at home. In fact, in the actual marketplace, transactions are increasingly denominated in dollars. Milei will make legal what is already underway. Dollarization would end the debilitating inflation crisis, thereby earning Milei the political capital to more forcefully pursue the rest of his agenda. His monetary move would also start the awakening among economists about the fundamental importance of a stable currency for prosperity.
To me, that's just a very representative of what the ruling elites would like in their fantasies from Milei running Argentina.
Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous on so many levels. It's hard to know where to start. First of all, this is not the first time that a right-wing politician in Argentina has dollarized. In fact, it has happened at least 2, maybe 3 times, depending on how you define it. And in each case, what happened is that Argentina had brutal hyperinflation. This is not the first time. You know, Argentina has a long history of being trapped in unpayable, odious debt. And just as in Germany, leading up to Hitler, it was hyperinflation that was caused by unpayable external debt denominated in a foreign currency because of the end of World War I and the Versailles Treaty and all of the reparations being put in Germany. It was not socialism that caused hyperinflation in Germany. And similarly in Argentina, it is unpayable, odious debt owed in a foreign currency that has been causing this hyperinflation multiple times. It's not the first time. And in previous experiences, right-wing leaders come to power and they dollarize the economy by pegging the currency to the dollar, which is the same thing. I mean, if you abolish your currency and adopt the dollar, what that is it's the most extreme form of a peg imaginable because you can't change the peg. It is the peg of 1-to-1, but it's the same in the sense that if you peg the currency to the dollar, if you peg the peso to the dollar, and even if you don't adopt the dollar as your official currency, it has the same impact. But if you run out of dollars in your foreign exchange reserves, then you can devalue it and change the peg, which is always what happens. Because in order to have the dollar as your currency, you have to have enough liquidity in the economy. Where are those dollars going to come from? Those dollars have to come from people buying your exports and paying you in dollars, or they have to come from debt. They have to come from outside of the country. So what has happened in the past is that the right-wing regimes have gotten those dollars by taking on huge amounts of debt. Argentina already has many tens of billions of dollars of debt that it can't pay off, which represents over 100% of GDP. So, and by the way, in the meantime, the net foreign exchange reserves of the central bank in Argentina are negative because China stepped in to try to stabilize the economy, and China gave yuan currency swaps to the central bank in Argentina to help Argentina pay off its debt to the IMF. So, quite literally, China was paying Argentina's IMF debt for it in an attempt to try to help stabilize the economy. Now, Milei is going to come in. Maybe he says to China, "Screw you. We're not going to give you that money back. We're going to default on the loans we essentially owe to China, but we're not going to default on the loans we owe to the IMF or on the loans we owe to bondholders on Wall Street." He may very well do that, obviously, just as an FU to China. But still, the net exchange reserves, foreign exchange reserves in Argentina are negative. They simply don't have the dollars to dollarize. So what it means is if he's really serious about this, he's probably going to take on even more debt. Now, in that video, he said that, okay, that right now the peso is worth about all of the pesos are worth about $50 billion. Well, we're also going to see a significant devaluation. And what he didn't mention is that the vast majority of Argentines are still paid in pesos, which means that there's going to be an extreme devaluation of the currency. And basically, every working person, 90% of the population of Argentina, is going to go completely bankrupt and their life savings are going to be lost. I mean, unless you have enough money and you have a foreign bank account and you can somehow get dollars. But there have been capital controls in Argentina because if they lifted capital controls, pretty much everyone would just exchange all of their pesos for dollars and it would collapse. So what Milei is calling for is quite literally bankrupting the vast majority of the Argentine population who are paid in pesos. Well, the rich elites have already stashed all their wealth in dollars. Now, in that video, he also made a sleight of hand. He said that Argentines have about $260 billion in offshore accounts and inside. He combined them. So what are they going to do? How are they going to incentivize all of these wealthy Argentines to take all their offshore money and bring it back to the country? This is what every country in the global south always tries to do. This is a chronic problem all across the entire world, is rich people stashing their wealth in offshore bank accounts. So he expects that Milei is going to magically encourage. I mean, it's ridiculous. Like these people and whoever that was, Forbes or whatever, like I think he's probably smart enough to know that that's an extremely stupid talking point, but it sounds sophisticated, but it's actually not true. Now, finally, I mentioned that this has happened multiple times where the government pegged the currency, the peso or previous currencies, to the dollar. They run out of foreign exchange, and there's a severe devaluation, and essentially the economy collapses. Now, what Milei has been saying is that his way to prevent that from happening, like in the past, is he wants to turn Argentina into Ireland. This is his new rhetoric. And, Ireland is well known because it's become basically another like corporate tax shelter where a lot of these US corporations, ostensibly US corporations, are legally based in Ireland because they basically pay no corporate tax. And so there's these legal loopholes. So these US companies can be registered in both the US and Ireland, but they say that all of their revenue is coming from their Irish affiliate, so they don't have to pay any taxes in the US or Ireland. Now, if they're already doing this in Ireland, why would any of these companies decide to go to Argentina? And furthermore, he keeps talking about how this has brought the people of Ireland so much wealth and prosperity, but it's ridiculous. Ireland's GDP figures are fake. They're completely fake. Apple itself is responsible for over 1/5 of Irish GDP. It's not real. It's imaginary, fictitious capital. So you can look at GDP in Ireland, and Milei says, wow, GDP per capita is over $100,000, making Ireland one of the richest countries on earth per capita. But that's not actually wealth in the pocket of Irish working people. If you look at disposable income in Ireland, it's still relatively poor compared to other countries in Europe. So this is, again, based on all these neoliberal economists. They always do these sleight of hands, and they talk about how GDP is growing and all of these things. But at the end of the day, when they talk about stability in the economy, what they're actually saying is that, yes, we're going to take a sledgehammer to the Argentine economy. We're going to bankrupt 90% of Argentine workers. They're going to lose all of their life savings, which is exactly what happened in Ecuador after the famous feriado bancario that was overseen by the right-wing president, Guillermo Lasso, a multimillionaire oligarch banker. They bankrupted the country. Everyone lost their life savings. They devalued the currency, and then they adopted the dollar. So they always conveniently, they don't mention that part. And that's why Yanis Varoufakis, the leftist former finance minister of Greece, I think he put it very well. He said, Milei's plan to dollarize Argentina is like nuking a country to fight COVID.
And so I don't claim that Steve is being smart here. I just think that Steve Forbes represents what the capitalists of the US would probably hold as their central position, and why I think, like, ultimately, I'm not going to play the clip and waste your time, but asked about these views that run counter to the official US State Department positions, like basically espousing support for policies that are not democratic, and also saying that he's doesn't think climate change is real, thinks it's a hoax. Then how are you going to work?
It's just an eccentric view. It's a weird view of his. What a quirky guy. He denies the most important problem in the entire world that every country is trying to do something about.
When Steve Forbes actually says that he's correct, that Javier Milei is onto science, I suppose. So, anyways, they were asked this, and they said, "Well, we're still going to work with him. They'll look past those." But if anybody who was in Venezuela on the left had those positions, then that would be used as a reason to have a new election immediately in like the month or second month after he won, and continue to force this person to keep going through voting until they lost, because that's the way that the State Department approaches left-wing leaders of Latin American countries and other parts of the world. But so I wanted to play just this one more, because just to give people a flavor of Javier Milei, but also to see in action someone who's part of the well-known part of the right-wing media ecosystem gushing over this presence. And I play this again to just prepare us for, I don't know, for some reason I didn't hear this with, I'm not saying it wasn't out there, but I didn't hear this with Bolsonaro, and it seems like there's something about Javier Milei that people are. I don't know if there's something that's happened in the last 3 or 4 years where people are desperate in the right to like grab onto something, and they're so tired of defending Donald Trump that they're trying to latch on to some foreign leader so that they can give themselves a break from what's been going on. Or maybe they're fed up with the own internal politics of the United States. But this guy I'm going to play, I think you know him, Dave Rubin, had like just he put it in the sense of like why the conservative right likes this guy. And then he played this clip with Tucker Carlson that I think really encapsulates again the appeal of Javier rising to power in Argentina, and then the appeal of voting for these kinds of fascistic leaders in other countries of the world.
Estado no puede dar nada porque no produce nada.
As we covered yesterday, there is a new president in Argentina, Javier Milei. He is now the president of Argentina because they have had massive government growth, complete devaluation of their currency. They have had a creeping socialism for a long time, craziness with gender stuff and all of the woke stuff. And he has come in to absolutely obliterate it. And listen to him talking about why you must fight the socialists and the wokesters and the people who want that ever encroaching government, which is directly connected to what Elon just said.
Donald Trump is running for president again in the United States, as you know. What advice would you give him?
Que continúe con su lucha
He should continue his fight
en contra del
against socialism,
socialismo, porque es
because he is
uno
one
de
of the
los
few
pocos que entendió
who truly understood
cabalmente que la pelea
that we
es
are
contra el
fighting
socialismo,
socialism,
que la
that we
pelea
are fighting the
es contra los
statists.
estatistas.
Trump is
Y
anti-statist. He
comprendió
understood perfectly
perfectamente que
that the
la
generation of
generación de
wealth comes from the
riqueza
private
proviene
sector.
del sector privado. Es decir,
The state does
el
not
Estado
create
no
wealth.
crea riqueza,
The state
el Estado la
destroys it.
destruye. El Estado no puede
The state
dar
can give
nada
you
porque
nothing
no
because it
produce
produces
nada.
nothing.
Y cuando lo
And
quiere
when it
hacer,
attempts
además
it,
lo
it
hace
does so
mal.
poorly. So I'd
Entonces,
say,
me parece que si yo,
if I could humbly
desde
offer
mi
advice,
pequeño lugar, lo único
all I
que
could say
podría
would be to
decirle
double
es
down on his
que
effort
redoble los esfuerzos en la misma
in the same
dirección
direction,
de
defending
defender
the
las
ideals
ideas
of
de la
freedom
libertad y de no
and
darle
refusing to
tregua
give an
ni un
inch
solo
to the
segundo a
socialists.
los socialistas.
I don't know
You
why
get
that's
it?
profound, but
You
they
get
think
it?
it
So the
is.
people of San Francisco, the people of California, they let it in. They let it spread. They didn't fight. Most of the people elected the very people who ushered it all in. Argentina, after 20 years of this nonsense, is pushing back. Donald Trump was pushing back. There are pockets, places like Florida, that are pushing back. You should be pushing back. And might I suggest that we all go a bit more on offense.
I don't know why he does that like Irish accent at the end there, but he kind of does.
I cannot imagine hearing that clip and thinking that either of any of those people in the clip are in any ways like wise and are providing some kind of insightful advice on or insight into the world. It's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, he says that Trump is anti-statist, which is hilarious. I mean, unlike Milei, unlike Argentina, the US can run a massive, massive, massive deficit, which is what Trump did. It's the exact opposite of anti-statism. Trump was a huge statist. And the irony is that Republicans love to talk about the problem of government deficits, and the deficit exploded under Trump. I mean, so the hypocrisy is outrageous. I mean, but also it's so funny hearing people portray Argentina as socialist. First of all, Rubin said it, that Argentina has been socialist for 20 years. Well, Argentina has never been socialist. And by the way, you know who the president was until 2019? It was a right-wing multimillionaire oligarch, Mauricio Macri, who is the one who took on the biggest IMF debt in history, the biggest IMF loan in history, over $50 billion, of which $45 billion was dispersed to Argentina. It was not the current government in Argentina that took on all this debt. It was ironically the right-wing oligarchs who attack the left and claim they love to spend so much in the government, right? So the right loves government spending when they're in power, but they love government spending on things that help rich people and that hurt the working class. mean, so again, it's just this ridiculous false canard that they keep saying. And now, I'm not in any way defending the current Argentine government. It's been a complete disaster. And the Argentine left has been saying this from the beginning. Now, the current president, Alberto Fernandez, is a centrist neoliberal. So I mentioned that in Argentina, the ruling government has a very wide tent coalition of Peronists from the left, including the Kirchner followers, the Kirchneristas, to the kind of center right neoliberals like Sergio Massa. And Alberto Fernandez, the current president, was supposed to be a kind of unifying centrist figure between all of them. He's been completely incompetent and horrible. And basically, anytime that Cristina Fernández de Kirchner wanted to do something progressive, Alberto Fernandez said no. They're of no relation. Obviously, Fernandez is a very common last name. And he just denied her, which is why, at multiple points during the current government in the past 4 years, Vice President Kirchner, she publicly criticized the president. Can you imagine in the US, the vice president publicly criticizing the president? I mean, anyway, so the point is that the ministers that she appointed in the cabinet were kicked out. I mean, it's been a complete disaster. And Alberto Fernandez claimed originally that he was going to fight against the IMF and that he was going to play hardball and not let the IMF extort the country. And he completely capitulated. And that's why Argentina is in this disaster. It's not the first time. Again, this is such a long history of of Argentina being trapped in what is essentially a U.S. debt trap. You know, we hear all this propaganda about Chinese debt traps. Argentina is in a U.S. debt trap owed to the IMF, which is controlled by the U.S., and owed to asset managers, investors largely based in the US, right? These bondholders. And there's a history of these vulture funds famously owned by billionaire oligarchs like Peter Singer, the vulture, who famously used the US justice system to force Argentina to pay hundreds of percent interest on the debt that he bought up at low rates when Argentina defaulted. And the US justice system used Argentina's foreign assets, basically stole them, just like the US has stolen the foreign assets of Russia and Venezuela and Iran and Venezuela. Well, the US also did that to Argentina. And even the United Nations warned that the precedent established by the US doing that was horrific and would cause horrible repercussions across the global South. So Argentina has always been the poster child of these kind of neo-colonial debt traps. And people act as though it's all socialism. Argentina has never been socialist. And again, the right wing was in power for the 4 years before, from 2015 to 2019. And the past 4 years, at best, you could say have been a centrist government, not a leftist government.
Yeah. All right. So if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you about Israel and a question that I wanted to get to, but is it okay if I do that for the paying subscribers of the show? Is all right with you, Ben?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just sign off and say thank you to people for watching this part of the podcast. And if you want to go to geopoliticaleconomy.com, you can find Ben's newsletter. I don't know, is there anything else you wanted to plug? You do regular interviews at your YouTube channel, but if there's anything else you wanted to plug, go ahead.
Well, yeah, people should really go check out the YouTube channel and the podcast. I actually update those. I update those more than the website, just because I'm sure you know that, you know, it's sometimes frustrating as a journalist. You spend all this time writing an article, and you get, if it's good, you get a few thousand views, and then, you know, I make a video and I get way more views. So honestly, these days I put more work into my videos and podcasts. So people should go, and it's the same name. So people should just check out Geopolitical Economy Report, and you can find it all there.
Yeah, that's where everything's going. I mean, there's not a lot of incentive to sit down and do written journalism because, I mean, even people want to just watch these like reels, these short form reel clips. And so you just do an hour of content and then you just keep slicing and dicing and sharing it for the next week so that you can generate any sort of like income and make it worth being a journalist in this world. So thanks, everyone. And we'll be back next week with another show.